Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. We are super excited today to welcome Allison Gerard, Managing Director of Moral Courage, to the show. Hi, Allison.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Before we get into what moral courage is and all the cool work that you're doing out there in the world, I would love to introduce you and hear more about your background and share with our listeners.
Allison as the person, the full complex person. Yeah, I'd love to share some of that. So most of my work experiences in managing teams. I did that for a really long time. I was a stay-at-home mom for about 10 years. I have 3 kids. And you could say I was a non-traditional college student. I went back to school after my youngest got into first grade and finished up my bachelor's degree in psychology and then went on to do a master's in management and leadership. And there was a point where I was thinking, okay, do I actually want to go into counseling and learn more about psychology and work with individuals and couples? Or do I want to go back into management? And ultimately, with the master's, the management won out. But I still have this, the way people talk to each other still really interests me. And I think just that the entrained patterns that we can get in, we're not even aware of how we're communicating, and being able to kind of work with that. What are the possibilities for change between people and within families? And then, that can scale up to organizations and maybe even to politics. So, yeah, I am here now with Moral Courage, and I can tell you a little bit about that if you'd like, or
Maybe just before we get to moral courage, I'm curious to hear more about that decision process where you know I I love psychology and was really interested in psychology as a student and have maintained that interest on the side. And I also ended up in management and leadership. And I'm just curious what that decision was like for you and how you see the connection between your psychology background and the decision to work in leadership and management.
yeah, that's a good question. There's a book called Reboot by Jerry Colonna. I don't know if you've heard about that, but that book, I remember standing in my home after reading that book and thinking, no, I'm going to go into management, because he brought such a relational aspect to leadership. And I could see how what I learned in psychology could work with teams. But in working with teams, you get more of the fun stuff. So you're working with different skill sets and personalities, and I'm super competitive. I like achieving goals. Whereas in psychology, I worried that it would be taxing on me, on my life. You're hearing about people's problems. It's very difficult work. And so I just wanted more of the fun stuff that could happen in the workplace.
Gotcha. I think where I've ended up with that is realizing for myself anyway, I don't know if this is true for other leaders, that when you work with teams, you end up dealing with all of their baggage too, whether you know it or they know it or not.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work that's done around improving communication in teams is helping people get out of their own way in much the same way I think gets done in a therapeutic context. It's just that the context is really different.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I think what I've learned is that whatever the problem is you're talking about, or the issue, is not really the issue. There's a whole lot of experience behind that that's shaping how this person sees their work, or sees, even their peer relationships. And just the ability to ask questions to kind of get to what is this really about. And sometimes people have not ever been asked really sincere questions. They People aren't curious about their lives, and it's amazing what can happen when you're approached without judgment or assumptions. And people are really interested in your life, and from there you open up possibilities for seeing yourself differently, for seeing each other differently. And I think that helps to build trust. And trust is super important for a functioning team, because there's going to be times where you're going to have to say the hard thing. And do you have enough resilience within that team for each other to handle that, that directness sometimes, that, I'm going to tell you, I think you're wrong on this point, and we've got to make sure that this whole relationship doesn't break. So it's that trust building. Have you experienced that too? Oh, as I see you nodding.
Um, yes, and I think the topic of trust is fundamental, and I also love what you said about people seeing themselves differently through the conversations that they have, and the role of sincerity in that also, or what we've been referring to also as authenticity in some of the recent episodes that we've done. And it's funny, a couple of episodes back, we talked about the role of courage in authenticity. And Brian had a great rap about how, actually, I think, Brian, you used the phrase moral courage when you were talking about the authenticity needed to show up as your most authentic self, or the courage needed to show up as your most authentic self so that growth would be possible and development and, um, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I would just like to underline that seems to be almost foundational to the work that you're doing is that, when we live our normal lives and we get up and we go to work and we see people, we have a sort of an autopilot way of going about that.
Hmm.
And the position that other people fill in that story is sort of set.
Hmm.
And what we've talked about here before on the podcast, we've used the term semantic world, and we're fond of saying that every person is born in a particular room of a particular house on a particular street on a particular section of town, and they're born in that room with their foot nailed down, and that sort of represents the place that their world is assembled around. And so when we have two people come from two different places and they have an interaction in the workplace, what we see is A said this and B said this. And but what really happened here was these two cognitive maps of the world had to find a way to share a worldview. Like they had to overlap somehow, and that's this idea of this fusion of horizons,
Mm.
so that we're really dealing with the whole person in the interaction here, even though we only hear blah 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 whatever they said. And so I think that maybe a first foundational place to talk about, certainly about morality and ethics, is we have to talk about values. And so values really come out of that semantic world. It's made up of our experience and our religion and our education and the things that have happened to us in our lives and all of these things. So Mike, one of my questions for you is, what you're really trying to do with a company is to get enough overlap in those worldviews that they can share values. Does that seem like or clarify values that they already hold? Or now I don't know anything. I'm from the outside, but I'm kind of assuming what you must have to be doing to do the work that you're doing. So what do you think? I mean, am
Thank you,
I
Brian. I love that. I'm having a couple thoughts. I would say that what we're trying to do is get people to combine their experiences so that they can change their perceptions. And it's not a forced change. When you share a story and I share a story, we learn to see the world from each other's perspectives. And we're not trying to force you to see something my way and, vice versa. But it just naturally happens. You could say it's an emergent thing. Perceptions, impressions change. So we really rely on a lot of storytelling. But I want to go back to something you said earlier. I think what you were saying is when we meet somebody, it's almost like they're an actor in our personal story. We're projecting onto them something that maybe isn't there. And I think maybe some neuroscience would be helpful here. So I think what most people don't understand, this is something I learned just a couple of years ago, was that our brains are not for thinking. They're meant to keep us alive. And so they're constantly scanning for threat. They scan for threat 5 times per second. And they're also helping us to manage our body budget. So it has to really manage all the energy we're using. And if something is going to conserve energy before it'll spend a lot of energy on perhaps getting to know someone like you, right? So what the brain does to preserve that energy is it makes predictions. Our brain predicts almost everything we do. So really, when I'm talking to you, what is coming at you is my predictions of who someone like you is. It's not really you yet, right? My brain is essentially asking, who is this person most like? Not who is this person? Who is this person most like? And the way that you update predictions is if there is a prediction that goes wrong. So if I have an assumption about you and you break that prediction, suddenly I have to pay attention. Something was off. And then I can get really curious about you. And then I can bring all my cognitive energy in and see what's really there that I didn't see before. And one way that we break predictions or we teach people to break predictions at Moral Courage is to not get offended by what someone says. Just treat that as, oh, that was unexpected. Can I ask questions? Can I get curious about this person? And if you're on the other side of that, let's say someone says something offensive to me, they might expect me to take the bait and lash back. But if instead I bring that curiosity, that's going to break a prediction in their mind. And then they'll have to think more deeply about who I am. So you break the entrained patterns of relating. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's moral courage is a lot about not being baited into getting too emotional. Emotions are great, they're data, but we need the emotions and we need the thinking, the rational thinking to go along with it. And I think in this us against them culture today, I mean, it's so polarized, we're constantly taking the bait.
Sure.
One side says something, the other side says something, and nobody's really thinking about the choices they have to
Right.
communicate differently.
Well, and one of the things that the post phenomenologists, the later phenomenologists, that had this idea that they took from the Greeks called epoche,
Okay.
and it gets translated as bracketing. And bracketing means that I'm seeing something, I'm trying to see something in itself. I'm not trying to see my reactions to it. I'm not trying to see the things that I bring to it. I'm just trying to bracket it, and that's that idea uh, where the phenomenologists are interested in uncovering the deeper truth. And so that's what I think we're talking about is meeting people on a deeper level, but we have to bring an awareness to that, and we have to kind of not contaminate it with our self.
Yeah.
Is it fair enough to say?
I think so, and maybe I can share a story with you, and then you tell me if we're tracking. I remember when my kids were little, so 3, 4 years old, going to the pediatrician, and I'll be honest, motherhood didn't come super easy to me because I'd come from that managing
Oh,
world, and I tried to manage my kids, and I became very frustrated when I didn't have the performance improvement plan. I didn't couldn't do the check-ins. They were not playing by these rules that I was so good at. And I remember being in the pediatrician's office and just, expressing this, like, this is so hard. And he said, it's really difficult to see what's going on when you're in the middle of it. So find a group of other mothers or fathers and talk about what you're experiencing. This really hit home to me when I went back to school because while I was there earning my bachelor's degree, I was able to work in a lab. And this lab studied how couples communicate. So they
oh,
would bring people into the lab and they would hook them up to monitors. So they're, testing their heart rate, their blood pressure, and even cortisol after the conversation. And these couples would pick a issue that was real and relevant in their relationship, and then they would talk about it. And the conversation was recorded. And we, as those working in the lab, would go back and watch those conversations. And we were supposed to pay attention and code things like defensiveness and contempt and belligerence and stonewalling, which is basically putting up a wall. You totally disengage from the conversation. And then we'd get together and talk about what we had observed. And what this taught me was, if I, in my personal life, could stand outside of my experience, stand outside of a conversation, I might be able to see my role in what's going on. And so this has become a practice for me to stand outside and see, okay, maybe I could change something in that relationship to get a different experience, different outcome. And that's where there's power. Because when we talk about complex systems, it's the relationship, it's what's going on between people that matters. And by changing what I say or do, it can change what is possible for the other person to say or do. And so, part of that is building different habits, because again, when you're in the middle of a conflict, gosh, there's ways that I feel comfortable doing, like I tend to be someone who's very direct and wants to get to the point and let's fix this. And I had to learn with my kids that doesn't work. That makes things worse, because when you go at an issue directly, humans will adapt. They might make you feel like they've changed, but really what's going on behind, when you're not looking, is more of the same, or things have escalated. And this is true whether you're parenting or whether you're running a team or you're running a country. People adapt.
Maybe before we go further down that track, why don't you talk some about moral courage so our listeners know what the organization's all about and what kind of work you do?
Yeah, moral courage. We teach people to have productive conversations about the issues they care about. There's a popular definition of moral courage, and it means speak truth to power. And this is the way Robert Kennedy referred to it back in the 1960s. And this is the way that our founder, Irshad Manji, learned moral courage. She had a teaching position at New York University, and she taught a course called Moral Courage. And while she was teaching, what she noticed is she had these students who really cared about the world, but when they were confronted with a viewpoint that differed from their own, they become very defensive and they start to label each other. And she started thinking, okay, in today's world, the definition of moral courage, it needs to be different. Moral courage needs to mean something different, because everyone was making statements and nobody was listening. So today, moral courage means it's the practice of speaking truth to the power of our primitive brain. So this part of our brain that's constantly scanning for threat, I mentioned earlier, scans for threat 5 times per second, speaking truth to that part of the brain so that we can more effectively speak truth to power out there. So it's not about changing your beliefs. We don't believe we can change each other's beliefs, but it's about understanding the role that you're playing in any interaction and showing up in the way that you really want to show up that is going to be effective. So you can stand your ground, and you can also create common ground with people who disagree with you, and it's all for the sake of moving forward. These conversations are not about being nice or civil. It's honestly about how do we get to work together across our differences. So that we teach 5 core skills. We teach those mostly in universities right now because they have a big need for it. We teach it in K through 12 schools and also in organizations. And I'll end with this. One thing that I'm really proud of that we do is we don't just say, here's a workshop, good luck, you now have the skills, goodbye. We take a journey with folks that want to take a journey with us. So I teach a mentor certification program that's 4 months long, and we practice the skills we teach, because building new habits takes time and it takes practice. And then people can go back into their organization and continue to mentor others.
Great. Thank you, Allison. I want to come back to how you get results in a sustainable way by training mentors, because I think that's a really powerful addition to the typical kind of workshop or coursework that one might come across. But maybe before that, I want to go back to you used the phrase we have to learn to stand outside ourselves. I think I'm remembering that correctly. And that makes me think about mindfulness practice and how in order to learn how to stand outside ourselves, we actually have to take on an individual practice, which means an individual responsibility and a discipline around building the skill, holding ourselves accountable to using the skill when it's most difficult to do so. Are you teaching people individual skills as part of the teaching them how to have difficult conversations?
Well, I would say moral courage at its core is about relational leadership. So, mindfulness, not so much, but it is kind of turning a situation around and looking at all different perspectives. And and mentors, when you talk about, what are the results in an organization, that's really difficult. It's difficult to measure what's happening in relationships. I like, you and I, Boaz, have kind of done an exchange on Nora Bateson's work of warm data, the information that's alive. And that's what we're really dealing with moral courage in these relationships. But I'll say this, like we can help each other do this. I had a friend reach out to me recently, and she's having trouble with her partner. They've been fighting a lot. They've got two young kids. And there were several conversations where I listened to her just tell me what was going on. And I started to get this perception of, oh, geez, maybe her partner really is kind of being a jerk. And then I heard his side of it. And now you're getting a fuller picture. And, my friend originally hadn't told me what she was doing. She couldn't even see her role. It was all about him and he needs to change. And there was a lot of blame. And so when I started to get the fuller picture, and we had built some trust, I could say things like, here's what I'm noticing you're doing. When he said this, you said this. And I'm acting as the outside perspective, right? And she couldn't hear me. She could not. And I thought, okay, I'm not helping. This is not good. But then I got a call a couple of days later, and she said, I was at my mom's house and there was an interaction between mom and dad, and mom did something and I saw myself. My mother was using these ways of being that I find myself in, and she said, I think what you were trying to teach me, Allison, was that I have a role in this, and there's something that I've learned in the home where I've grown up that I can change. And I tell you, I like that was the best news, to get a phone call like that. But I acted as that, and she trusted me to do this, to act as that outside perspective. And so we need to be there for each other. And what this means is I didn't take sides. I didn't take sides. You are both in this, and you are both co-creating this, outcome. So, Boaz, I do think that there is the individual practice, because I do practice that on my own, not so much in a mindfulness way, but there's also we got to be there for each other to help each other do this.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd like to also react to that. When you were mentioning that same section that Boaz mentioned, what I heard was what we call consciousness conscious of consciousness. And, I'm a kung fu teacher. So, where your consciousness goes in confusing and threatening situations is literally my specialty.
Mm.
And we call that the second attention. The first attention is the one that's actually in there fighting it out. The second attention is the one that sits back and it observes and says to yourself, okay, you're getting kind of freaked out. Just keep on an even keel, or don't take the bait, don't overreact. It's that awareness that's aware of the condition of your own consciousness. And that actually is a state of growth. It's actually an attainment. We don't just turn that on. We have to develop it. And I think that's why what you saw was actually a seed being planted, and then maybe when the conditions are right, then that awareness can come. But it's a tricky thing, and it really is a part of us. There's this idea within the world of ethics, within Confucian ethics, and also going back to Aristotelian ethics, that this is not something that we just do or we don't do. It's something that we grow at. It's something that we build our capacity for. And so, the idea of the superior man is what it gets translated in Confucianism, but it means the chunsu. And so the Chunsa doesn't just have judgment, he also has compassion and he also has perspective. But you don't just start there. You actually, and that's where this mentor idea really is the juice, because we don't just get somewhere by intent. We often need someone to model it for us, someone that actually has those. One of my teachers was a Green Beret in Vietnam, 2 tours. And when I would get in a difficult situation when I was very young, I would deal with it and I would hear his voice coming out of my mouth. What are you doing? Come on, you gotta, and it was literally channeling him because he had patterns to have those difficult conversations. He was someone that could actually go right up the middle and break through. And, it didn't always work. He had a girl come to try to sell him advertising for his school and fitness spa, and he said to her, "How can you represent me? You're so fat," right? And she was not fat. But when he said that, he had her, right?
Yeah.
But my point is that we do need people that have more experience, that have some of those patterns of how do we have those difficult conversations and how do we live through those difficult self-realizations about how, yeah, maybe we really are the problem. And maybe we need to have a certain amount of sand in our belly to admit that to ourselves.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's it. It really is a growth thing, and I think personal growth is probably the most important place that ethics or morality really comes from, right? Because, and I think maybe it's good for us, for our listeners, to distinguish between morality and ethics, right? Morality is kind of a personal thing that comes out of our own personal values, but ethics is when it starts to live collectively with us as a group. We hold these values, we all overlap on honesty and on fairness and on compassion and these sorts of things. So I think there's a real process there that's way more than just getting the work done. Way more. Because I'm a craftsman. I don't want to just finish the painting or the piece of furniture. I'm working on me, right? And so that's that process. And I just kind of wanted to point out that it really is an important growth as a human, sort of an item. You know, Aristotle said it brought us to the good life to be able to attain that.
Yeah, I like what you've said there, Brian. I think you said planting seeds allows people to kind of grow. I might say what I did with my friend was just kind of point to look in this direction, just try to open up what she can see. Um, and I agree with you. I've certainly felt that throughout my life, it has been a process of growth. I was early on, well, I'll tell you, I grew up in a family that had almost no communication skills. I mean, in my 20s, I remember listening to a podcast and it was on NPR, and the person being interviewed, first time I'd heard about the amygdala and how the amygdala can kick us into fight or flight. And that was the first time I felt some empathy for myself, because I felt like I had this nervous system that if I was in a social situation, it was like someone had just stomped on the gas pedal. And suddenly I was so activated and I was very socially awkward. I would look at classes, like college classes, and if there was an oral report, I was dropping that class. I would not stand in front of people. And I started to learn more about neurobiology and started to really develop skills. So I have it somewhere because I just purchased it as like an artifact, cassette tapes that were called the art of small talk. And I would put them in the recorder in my car and I would drive to work, and this person would teach me how to ask questions. And I would repeat, I would go out to dinner with my partner before I married him and I would practice these questions. I was probably super annoying in the beginning, but I started to get better. And then pretty soon people would come to me and say, "Hey, I've got a difficult conversation. Can you help me map this out?" And so I would. And this speaks to that development, the development of the skill set to have these really difficult conversations. And I've gotten to the point where, it takes I don't react to things like I used to. I had a brother who could provoke me, man. It was just like hanging bait in front of me, and I would just take the bait and we would be off on a roll. And he can't do that to me anymore. So it's just being super calm in the face of this. And I often think I'm not a superhero, but I love thinking about, how the superheroes are trying to figure out their skill set. And often there's like a scene where the environment, like things are just coming at them and they're just standing there and they're able to keep their composure. I feel that. I think about that in my mind sometimes when I'm in these difficult situations.
We say that whoever has the slowest heart rate has the most power.
Yes, I think I like that. But I'll tell you, though, sometimes my heart rate is going, 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 but the exterior sure makes you feel like it's beating at 52 for a minute.
That's that second attention, giving you choice, probably. A couple of things that you said reminded me of. I've mentioned Stan Tatkin before. He does, I think, mostly couples therapy based on attachment theory. But he talks about how we automate each other. Brian, you mentioned that earlier. And he also talks about how how the ways in which we communicate with one another are essential to kind of creating a container for a useful conversation to take place. So, like, one of the things he talks about is leading with relief, where you want to make the other person comfortable. Then you can perhaps be more direct or more honest or whatever. And I'm not saying be dishonest to make them comfortable. I'm saying, like, recognize where they are, and let them know that you're here to try to work this out, or that kind of thing. So, Allison, you also mentioned the environment in a couple of ways. When you talked about universities, you said they really need this right now, and you briefly mentioned politics earlier too. I'm curious. I guess I have a mental model that we're in a time of kind of unprecedented dynamism where various forces like social media and AI and things like that are making it harder for us to keep our attention and to know what the truth is, if there is such a thing, and connect with one another.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what you think, and I don't know if moral courage kind of has a rap about this in general, about what's going on in the environment that
Mhm.
that makes this work so essential.
Yeah. I can tell you a story. Begin with a story. So, this is the story about the slug. There is an amoeba that lives in the soil. So, if you go out there and you scoop up a handful of soil, you're probably going to have some of these little critters in there. And this amoeba lives as an individual cell in the soil, and it's eating all the food and living its best life, but it's surrounded by other amoeba. It's community. When the amoeba starts to starve, a few of them, they emit a chemical signal, cyclic AMP. And this chemical signal makes its way to the other cells. And even if those cells aren't yet starving, they emit the signal. And the signal says, band together. There's danger out here. And so all the amoeba move together and they form a sort of a slug, an actual slug. Slime mold is what we're talking about. And then that slug moves to a more nutrient rich area. And if they find those nutrients, then they replicate and they can disband. But I'm thinking about our political climate right now. And it's kind of like what's happening with the slug. There are messages of danger such as disrespect, not equal rights, no understanding. People are losing their jobs. Maybe resources are scarce. And, populist politicians, and this can happen both on the left or the right, use these words such as pro DEI, anti DEI, anything about the immigration issue, anything about identity. They use those words in a way that keeps a consistent signal of danger out in the population. And so what this does is it essentially keeps us in slug formation. where we are so attuned to these signals that we can't even see a way out. We stay in our camps. So what this means, I'll give you an example of what's going on in my family right now. I have some family members that voted for Trump, and I have some very liberal family members. And both of them thinks the other side is wrong. And the way that they talk to each other is the liberal side will send the Republican side a Bernie Sanders video talking about the oligarchy and all this stuff. And what do you think that tells the people on the conservative side? There's danger. Stay in formation. And the same thing happens when conservatives try to talk about identity and pronouns and things like that. Basically, all the pushback that's happening on DEI, which I think there needed to be some changes, but I think people are a bit intoxicated with their power and pushing back on this. And what does that signal to them? Stay in formation. So what are we going to do? Because you might say, well, isn't this an adaptive feature? I mean, there are absolutely dangers in the world. Why would we ever disband from our group? There is real danger out there. Well, what I would say to that, I'm not sure any other living being can do what humans can do, and that is distort communication. There's a term called schismogenesis that Gregory Bateson, Nora Bateson's father, coined. Okay, and what it means is the creation of breaking or the creation of division. We can distort messages. We can tell partial truths. We can tell lies, and we send those lies and partial truths out as signal. So how do we get out of this? We've got to recognize that there are conflict entrepreneurs who are distorting signal. And if we realize that, maybe we can have the courage to step outside of our group for a few conversations and see if we can combine those experiences, combine those stories, get to a better understanding of what's happening in our lives so that we can move forward together. So I'm hoping the skills of moral courage will help people get back to their individual thought. We're not saying get rid of your community. We need other people. It's just that we also need that diversity of viewpoint, because when you're in slug formation, when you're doing slug think, it's a very homogenous world. And we can't evolve and we can't adapt if everybody's the same or thinking the same.
It's interesting to me. You just mentioned diversity of viewpoint, and there was a period, I want to say like 4 or 5 years ago, when the people trying to step out of the divisiveness, and I think it was specifically around DEI, because the word diversity was being used in this other way in the phrase diversity of viewpoint. Like, what we need is viewpoint diversity. And then after a couple of years of kind of the champions of viewpoint diversity or heterodoxy, were kind of delivering that message, it seemed to get co-opted into, well, that's a dog whistle for anti-DEI. So now if anybody says viewpoint diversity, you can assume they're on the other team, as opposed to trying to build a bridge. And I think that happens a lot, that the phrasing we use or the common language we create gets interpreted or misinterpreted or co-opted in ways that we're always having to invent new ways to talk about moral courage, for example. Like, I hope this doesn't happen, but I could imagine a universe in which somebody who's resistant to getting out of formation starts to say something along, maybe it's happened already, that moral courage is a dog whistle for trying to get us to let go of our values, and these values are important, so don't listen to the phrase moral courage. Like, that's a right.
Yeah.
Curious if you have any
I'm
experience of that.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up, because in the case of viewpoint diversity, I do think it's true that people who touted viewpoint diversity actually weren't very open to other viewpoints. It can be used. It can be used to kind of just keep things the way they are. I think there's some truth in that. But I also think what's contributing to this is we often try to directly correct or go at directly the problem we want to solve. And in a complex system, you've got to meet people around. So talking about viewpoint diversity is probably not the best thing to do, but developing skills where you can actually open up a conversation where the viewpoint diversity is like an emergent property. It's happening because you're meeting someone with respect and their story's coming out and your story's coming out. So I think that's part of the problem. We tend to look at these social issues from an engineering perspective. If I just fix those parts, if I fix even the word, like you say, sometimes we've got to come up with other words. I agree with you because you can get entire narratives compressed into one word. There's a whole bunch of baggage that comes along, and you feel like, okay, well, maybe we need to use something else. But I think more than that, we've got to get to the point where we're understanding the complexity we're working in. Boaz, you are not someone to be fixed. Brian, you are not someone to be fixed. I can't just change a policy and think that's going to fix you or tell you what kinds of words you can say and that's going to fix you. We need to approach this differently. And I'll tell you what, across the board, people are using this engineering perspective. And I can share more of that if you're interested, because I have some real world examples.
Well, I'd like to put this in a bit of a bigger context,
Sure.
and I'd be interested in your idea of this. You know, when I look at the story of history going into prehistory, it it seems to be a game about power. And you said moral courage is about speaking truth to power. Um, I associate moral courage with picking your hill to die on. So because of that, the disequilibrium in power, right? So when I read history and I see the Greeks and they come up with democracy, I see one little step. Now, yeah, there were slaves and there were different strata, but still there wasn't just a dictator, there wasn't just a king. And then I flash forward and I see the Reformation and this doctrine of the universal priesthood, that each individual has their own relationship to God and you don't need a priest to intercede for you. And then I see the French Revolution, egalite, fraternité, right? And then I see the American Revolution again, updated in the Civil War, but with this idea that the individual has a say now. So that's the first half of the prelude. The second half is I heard a story about a colleague who, or he had a colleague that was in the war that was interrogating prisoners. And his job was basically if he lied to the prisoner and said he wouldn't be executed, he'd get information. And if he didn't lie, the guy wouldn't give him the information. Either way, he was going to get executed. So he found that he was in that moment, he could not lie to the man. And so he didn't. And so the comment was made later, I guess he wasn't the guy for that job. And so it made me think with this structure of hierarchy and the imbalance of power, I feel like we've seen the morality, the ethics, or the control of the ethics kind of pushed up to the C suite. And everybody else down below, they're not really, the board will make the decision of what the morality of our organization and the ethics of our organization will be. And it's not your job below the board to have a say. You're not on the board of directors. So it seems to me that we're in an environment now where, because of these liberating technologies, because of the broad spread education, the individual is more empowered. And the individual now is more, with power comes responsibility. And that responsibility is to take moral stands, even though you're not the high part of the totem pole, you're on the lower part of the totem pole. So I'm interested in how you see this as like a stage of development through history, all about the empowerment, but also the imbuement of responsibility all upon the individual.
Mm. Yeah. Well, a note on power. I think there's a couple ways to look at it, as it is the top of the hierarchy, but we can also look at it as distributed throughout populations. So we know people can come together and work together to make change happen. I also think that you're right that the pressure on the individual has never been greater to be, know what your identity is, know what you want, to be able to promote yourself. Um, do I believe that it's just that we suddenly realize we have more power because we can speak up and make choice? I don't think so. I don't think we understand the power that we have. And like with social media and those signals that there's danger out there, I don't think people are really stepping into that power or thinking clearly. Um, do you have an example that's on your mind about this kind of dynamic that you're noticing?
Well, I'm thinking about whistleblowers.
Okay.
I'm thinking about people that have to throw themselves on the sword because of a moral issue.
Mm,
And a related question is, do we learn that, or is it an intuition? Is it something that we're born with, or is it part of our character to want to make like a Snowden, or can't remember the other guy. You know who I mean. Um, these people that basically sacrifice their whole life because they think the truth needs to be told,
yeah.
and they were engaged in a situation, or confessions of an economic hitman. He's a good example of that.
Mm,
It's like I was part of a system that I could just keep it shut, and I'd make mad cash. I'd get prizes. I'd be rewarded. People would think I had swagger, and all I had to do was keep my mouth shut. You know, and the reason I say that is because I look around me, and that's all I see. Is I thought like 30 years ago, I thought I had a democracy. Now I think I have a democracy.
oh, yeah.
And I see a lot of sellouts,
Yeah.
and I see these people that were supposed to be for the people. Now they're worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're not even ashamed about
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
And Confucius says that when the people at the top, when they're no longer ashamed about it and they no longer hide it, they lose the mandate of heaven. And in history, that's when the head chopping starts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's why I'm interested in these big pictures of cycles, and is there growth through time? Hegel had this idea in the phenomenology of spirit that humankind is trying to go through a big growth through history, and that we're going somewhere. And to me, the empowerment of the individual is a big piece of that story. And so I'm interested in how you see that, and the tension between that and the hierarchical structure, because if they don't like what you do, they will fire you.
Yeah. Uh, well,
Right?
I'm not so sure. What you kind of described was this linear development, and that's kind of, I think that can be a trap in ways, thinking about history that way, and you can push back if you want. I see more like these repeating patterns and processes, and you can even,
Okay.
there's some research on cultural epigenetics that culture is inherited through epigenetic changes to DNA,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
so it's not as if we're just progressing, developing, but we have setbacks all the time, and there are things embedded in our DNA that set us back to an earlier time, or we're let me get more clear on this with a personal example. So when I was back at the lab at the University of Utah, there was some research on pregnant mothers who were stressed. What if they were highly stressed during pregnancy? What they could do is send more cortisol to the developing baby. Usually in the placenta, there's an enzyme that neutralizes that. But if cortisol gets through, it can get into the baby, and it basically is a signal to regulate the nervous system in a different way. And so the mother can basically communicate, it's going to be dangerous out here. You better be ready to fight. And this is an adaptive function. And so you can have traumas and things that are handed down in the form of how the nervous system responds and reacts to the environment. And so let's say, here I am, I'm a mother, I was pregnant 3 times. I didn't have a lot of skills when I was first pregnant with my kiddos. Did I hand down some of that reactivity to them? Probably. Now, as an adult, I continue to develop, but now they're on the same path that I was on. So it's not as if we're all, on the same path. and they might not even choose to do what I've done. So I think about, like, going back to complexity, all of these things are entangled, and it's very difficult to say, if we start here, can we end up here? um, I'm going to let you say something. Am I missing what you were talking about, or are we kind of tracking?
Well, no, I mean, I guess that on some level, it's a question of teleology. Or is there an end that we're moving towards? But it's also the question: are things getting better or are they getting worse?
Oh, well, my opinion, I think, I don't know. I mean, there's been instances in history that have been horrific, but I'll tell you, I'm a little bit worried today, and I do think there are repeating patterns. So let me share this with you. Um, I've been thinking about Mao in China in the 1950s a lot, because I think what he did was he took this engineering mindset to his society. So he wanted to make China into an industrial powerhouse. And the way he was going to do it is manufacture a bunch of, or grow a bunch of grain and sell it to countries like Russia. They would purchase the grain, send money back to China so that they could invest in their infrastructure. And part of that plan involved making sure the population was healthy. And so he developed this four pest campaign, which you might be aware of, and it's getting rid of flies and mosquitoes and rats and sparrows. And I want to talk about the sparrows, because he thought they needed to be eradicated because they would come and eat the grain stores, and then of course they wouldn't be able to get the money they needed. And so he told everybody in China to go out there and kill those sparrows, and they smashed the eggs and they killed the birds. And there's even video of people with long poles with flags at the top, and they're swirling it around, and they're making it so that the birds can't land. The birds become so exhausted they just fall to the ground and they die. Time comes for the crops to be harvested, and the locusts come in. And the locusts eat a lot of the crops, right? And that's where we recognize that the sparrows were actually very protective, but we didn't understand that relationship, or they didn't understand that relationship at that point. But here's what Mao does. He doubles down. I can't show the world that my plan has failed. So I'm going to continue to sell the grain to Russia at the expense of starving my people. And so people starve. And then I learned that they actually had grain stores where they could have released that and they could have saved their people. So Mao became so intoxicated with his project and his identity and his status that he couldn't even admit that maybe his plan was wrong. Now, I'm going to compare that to what Trump is doing right now. I'm not saying Trump is Mao. I know this can be risky. What I am saying is Trump is using that engineering approach. He has something he wants to do. He wants to make the United States into this powerhouse society, bring manufacturing jobs back to the US. And what he's going to do is he's going to implement tariffs, and he's going to do it across the board. And it's alienating partners and people who have spent money here. We have mentors in Canada, and I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal that people in Canada that have homes they've purchased here are selling those homes and just moving back. The one thing that got Trump's attention was the increased interest rate on the bonds. So we had a spike in interest rates on bonds, and that, I hear from reporting, influenced him to kind of put a halt on the tariffs, 90-day halt, because we hadn't seen quite high interest rates since, in like 20 years. And I'm pointing this out because it shows the ripple effects of what he's doing. And it's the mindset that I'm trying to point out here. It's the approach, it's the engineering approach, because when you become too attached to your program, too attached to the idea, and you are invested in your identity, in your status, you may continue on with that project at the expense of everyone in your country. And I think we're already seeing signs of that. It worries me.
A question that I would have is, see, we have seen through history a cycle of protectionism, expansion, protectionism, expansion. I think that was one of the curious parallels between Trump and Grover Cleveland, because immigration was a big issue, tariffs were a big issue. So there does seem to be a cyclic pattern. Because what I would point out is that while there's a tendency to point to Trump, I would also point to the polls that seem to be reacting to the protectionist message. So that's where I think there's a balance, and that, we talked about this in one of our episodes with a political historian, that there seems to be the collective mind, and of course, there's a battle for the collective mind to sway it one way or to sway it another way, but it also seems to go through cycles. And so it seems like there are people, I think, as you mentioned, that are monetizing the confusion. We say in Chinese strategy that the best time to rob a house is when it's on fire. So my interest is because, when you want to have fun at parties, do what I did. When there's a big election like between Trump and Biden, go to people and say, "Do you really think it matters who wins?" Talk about having difficult conversations. Right? But my point was, are we riding a big cycle? Like you pointed out, that there are cycles that go through. And are the people really just placeholders for the characters that are in that play when we come to that part of the cycle? Because we do see, we talked about this also, group identity, and it's like on a dial. Is us, me and my family, is us my village, is us all the English speakers, is us all the two-legged creatures, and we kind of spin that dial based on the setting that we're in. I'm sure that you're aware of that, because within a company there are different definitions of who's us.
Mhm.
Is it us management? Is it us the in crowd? Is it us the whole company? Is it us the industry of everybody who produces this work? And based on our setting, we change that us.
Yeah, right.
And those are the kind of like psychological dynamics that I suspect really drive these things. I have this image of the fleas sitting on there tugging on hairs, thinking that they're driving the dog. And as long as the dog is kind of going in the way he wants, they like that. And then when the dog takes a turn they don't like, they start tugging on hairs.
Mhm.
And then they're surprised when the dog doesn't change. Or the idea, for example, if you have a race car that has no brakes, doesn't really matter who's steering or which race car driver you put in behind the wheel, because the thing has no brakes. Has no good skill that will drive a racing car with no brakes, right? So those are my kind of questions, is because we have a certain amount of choice, but the future is always probabilistic. We're always trying to predict, but we never really know. And a lot of these things are unconscious and they're group related. And that's kind of a related thought that I have about moral courage. Moral courage seems to involve not just speaking truth to power, but standing up against the social group with whom you're identified, with whom you might be deriving personal sense of value, but realizing, I'm not going to lie to that prisoner and tell him that they're not going to shoot him, because something in me says that that's just not right. This is an approach to ethics they call deontology, from deon, the Greek root of duty, it means. Like, I just have a duty. So anyway, those are kind of my reactions to that. And in relation to moral courage, I mean, it's all fine and well, and everybody likes to speak truth to power, but telling their friends, like you mentioned in your story, telling your friends, well, maybe I don't see it that way. Now I've got a real personal price to pay. How do you deal with supporting people in that?
It hasn't everything to do with how you're having these conversations. So if you're trying to force a change, if you're trying to say the way you're thinking about this issue is wrong, that's going to backfire every time. Unless you've got a lot of trust. But what's a better idea is bring some humility. I've been thinking about this. I'm not sure I entirely agree with where we've been moving. Let me tell you kind of how I've been grappling with this, and then you let me know what you think. You're going in with humility, but you have enough confidence to actually have the conversation, and you're asking for their feedback. So standing up for what you believe, it doesn't have to be this big performative action. It can just be a simple, thank you for sharing that perspective. I wouldn't have thought about it that way. And I'm still thinking I'm going to do this thing. This is the decision I'm going to make. It doesn't have to be performative. It doesn't have to be big. It just is what you're going to do. And you're still teaching people how you are in the world. You are showing that you have integrity. You're trusting them to be able to handle your perspective. And you're still going to make a decision that's right for you.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Often the performative part happens on the part of the in group that's trying to ostracize you for exhibiting moral
That's
courage.
right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that brings us right back to the new definition of moral courage is it can't simply be speaking truth to power because you can't make a difference if you're just making statements all the time. And with social
right,
media, everybody's making a statement. So
right,
you've got to be careful in your statement. Like what kind of statement are you making? Because you might not be teaching the lesson you think you're teaching. You might be
right.
teaching a different lesson.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a guest, a man, by the name of Paul Fenn, who was trained in, Western philosophy, continental philosophy, and, his reaction to, the Frankfurt School, I think Adorno and some of those, the critical theory people, he came to a similar conclusion, was that you can't just have negative critique.
Mhm.
You need to actually have positive critique. And so what he focused on was writing laws that created new possibilities rather than critique against the old system, which was infused in the old possibilities, right? And so there is a kind of a maybe a reformed postmodernist thrust that seems like maybe is the future for moral courage.
I wouldn't. No, I mean, honestly, again, we don't tell people what to think or to feel. Like, there are people in our group that have all different viewpoints, and it's really grounded in how we're wired. So it's not like we're all, moral courage isn't some big ideology. It's simply a
Well,
skill.
that's what I mean. It seems like an upgrade on the postmodernist negative critique, in that it isn't just a negative critique. It's like, look, here's how we build into the future past this,
Possibly,
giving
possibly.
people tools, bringing awareness to this, which it seems to me ideology is exactly not that.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly, exactly.
when you're telling people, be aware of your behavior, be aware of what you're bringing to this and what your contribution is. Um, that to me seems the opposite of just a negative critique. If they come away with tools.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about equipping people and I've been trying to be more careful with telling people what they need to do. I know I can talk like that, but it's really more of an invitation. Like here's a skill set, use it or don't. Whatever. But here's what the probabilities are, the possibilities are if you use it and here's what might happen if you don't and then you choose. But I want to say something about the negative critique because I think that also applies to Trump. One thing that I think will make things worse is if going after Trump and continuing to humiliate him from people who oppose him, what that does is entrench and make him more resistant to hearing what you have to say. And there are others in that really are looking at the politics right now and they're saying if you could just leave that alone. Sometimes you have to point out the things that are working, right?
Right.
It's like with every other human, it can't be 100% negative. Here's what you're doing and screwing up, whether it's in your family or your team or politics. And people think, oh, well, Allison, how could you even say that? He's an atrocious. Well, I am saying it because there are
It's not a
some things
valid
that need
critique
to be
if you're not, yeah.
recognized that he's doing that are good. And,
Right.
I just don't want to make things worse. You can radicalize people. You can make things worse if you're just
Mhm.
so focused on what they're doing wrong all the time.
Well, and you can also undermine your own argument if your arguments are overly two-dimensional
Hmm. Yeah.
or too reactive, or if you present them while modeling emotional dysregulation, which seems to be really popular nowadays. um, which is so common now. I have to wonder if there's an agenda, an intentional agenda to undermine that narrative by marrying it with emotional dysregulation. Almost like you can join the other team and play so badly that you can ensure that they lose?
I don't know if there's any grand plans. I don't know.
I I'm wondering if we could, expand on, one of the ideas that I've heard come up a few times around identity, and, we talked about identity a little bit in the context of moral courage potentially being looking at the group with whom we associate and from whom we derive identity and needing to differentiate because we need to speak truth to that group. And so there's kind of like a change in the relationship with one's identity that has to take place in order for that subsequent conversation to happen with the group. And we've talked about identity, Allison, on the podcast at various times as kind of a mystery. Like there are all these layers of it, and all the way at the bottom, what is there really, right? And we've talked about kind of some different theories about that. And I'm wondering, there's so much focus on identity now, and humans are so wired to identify with groups in particular ways. Do you see in the work that you're doing development in how people think about identity, how we're collectively relating to the idea of identity? What are you encountering out there?
Well, I would say go back to the concept of plural. So, if there's one way that we talk about identity, is that we're all so much more than you can see. I think you mentioned there needs to be almost, or there might need to be almost a change in what identity is or means. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what popped in my mind was, yeah, maybe being a learner is part of an identity that we can adopt. And I also think that we should reckon with the possibility there is really a material reality to identity. So when I was talking about cultural epigenetics, I think there's something in our DNA that points to identity. If culture can be handed down, if we are wired in some ways to behave in certain ways that mirrors our culture that our ancestors had, I think that's important to recognize. And I think if we can recognize that, then we'll stop trying to fix people who live in different cultures than what we might think are the good ones. Stop trying to fix each other and maybe just approach each other with more empathy and curiosity. And I want to go back to the nervous system. So I talked about the epigenetic inheritance that might affect the nervous system. You may have some people in certain families and groups that are more reactive than others. And then you pair that with social media. And so is the right thing to say, no, that's too emotional, you shouldn't act that way? Or can we engage them with the skills of moral courage so that we can both regulate our nervous systems? Like, I think this has to happen in relationships. And I agree, Brian, with you totally that social media, it's not a good platform for helping people think clearly, right? We're sharing things based on emotion. So yeah, I'm also thinking about this new science of 4E cognition, that who we are is not all in our head. It is experienced through our body and through the environment. So what is around me, the material items, the desk, the monitor, I see your faces on the screen. This influences who I am in this moment. So paying more attention to how the environment shapes us. Yeah.
Very hermeneutical.
I just was? Okay.
Ve Well, this idea of hermeneutics is one that we've been talking about, having to do with the part being defined, or you can only understand the part in light of the whole that it's a part of, and that we really only understand the whole by parsing out the parts and sort of getting it from both sides. And usually the idea is like when you read a book, you start out with an idea what the book is like, And then you read the first page, and that's confirmed some of the parts, and it's changed it a little bit. And then with each page you read, you grasp the whole more, but you actually the next page now hits different because you've got the rest of it to say.
The context.
And then the idea that our life is basically the book and each page is the day. And so we're constantly kind of updating ourselves in that loop. And again, I guess a lot of this does come down to part and whole because Bo's point about identity, when I think about morality and I think about the guy who wouldn't lie to the prisoner, I can imagine internally he was saying to himself, I'm not somebody who does that.
Mhm.
And that it was rooted in a vision of who he is
Yeah.
and how he carries himself in the world and as an expression of his personal philosophy and his personal values. And so, that issue, when it comes into conflict with the group, especially a group that's armed that'll shoot you for being a traitor, uh, I mean, that to me is the setting of moral courage, is that personal development. And I know that's kind of Confucian and kind of Aristotelian, but I'm wondering now in the modern world, we have the scientific revolution, and within ethics, there is this thing they call the grounding problem. Now that we're into science, we measure what is, but I think David Hume said we can't easily go from is to ought. And so, if now that God is gone, because we can't prove him scientifically, where do we ground our values and our morality? Is it purely social? Is it purely personal? Is it, and from the standpoint of moral courage, where do we expect people to take that foundation to speak truth to power, or to, your more updated version? They still need to kind of take a stand. And so there's got to be something you're standing on, right? What do you think about that?
I think I'll push back a little bit because, well, let me tell you this. In the beginning, when I was thinking about moral courage, I would describe it as personal transformation for the sake of social transformation. So there was something that needed to change in us. And I've come to realize that that might not be actually what it is, because I may have come across as saying you have to change yourself to practice these skills, to practice moral courage. I don't believe that anymore. I believe we're just teaching a skill set, and that it might be arrogant for me to say, you've got to transform yourself. I don't believe that anymore. Um, so I'm not sure important change happens always when someone takes a stand. I think it happens when people take advantage of possibilities. And what this means is you are paying attention to your environment and the next right step to take. Sometimes when people are making a stand, they're not even connected what the possibilities are on the ground. Are
Oh,
we
for sure.
even able to do this thing? So you've got to understand where you are, have an idea of where you want to go, and then take the necessary steps. So think about it like crossing a river. And maybe you can't see the stones that are under the river. The water's up to your waist. You know you need to get to the other side, but exactly what decisions you're going to make or what direction you're going to take is not clear. You take the first step, you look again, where am I? Reassess, take the next step. And that's what we're trying to teach people to do at Moral Courage. So it's not it's not these grand plans. It's equipping people in their individual lives, families, work teams. How can you work together to make change so that it's just emerging, it's just happening, you're working on it together. So we don't need these other big programs, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. How does that land with you both?
It sounds pragmatic,
Mm, yeah.
which is for me, that's a positive.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah.
I'm really interested in what you said about transformation maybe not being needed, or moving away from the definition of moral courage as personal transformation in order to achieve social transformation, because that is my model.
I
And
know.
when I think about climate change, My approach is attacking treating it as an engineering problem, to use
Mhm.
your phrase, and kind of trying to deal with energy infrastructure and deal with carbon technology and political negotiations. To me, it is all kind of external change. And I have the probably naive mental model that rather, if we all spend time working on ourselves, then our relationship to the environment is also going to change. Or even more specifically, if we take time to work on our relationship individually with the environment and integrate our way of living with the environment in ways that maybe we've lost sight of, then our relationship to problems like climate change will inherently also change. So that personal transformation driving social change is kind of what I thought we were doing. And so
Mhm.
I'm really interested in maybe it's semantic where you're saying that it's arrogant for us to think that somebody might need to transform,
Mhm.
but I'm not sure it's arrogant for me to think that I do.
No.
And to see how my tendency to live a more intellectual life and less of a hands-on life might contribute to choices that I make around things like energy. So yeah, I kind of got stuck on that part of it, and I'm still ruminating on it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have on my bulletin board here the definition of wisdom as the ability to discern and apply universal principles and values that foster personal growth, well-being, and the greater good. But I think that what you're saying is that, I mean, and that's a big job. And it seems to me that moral courage is really much more focused on that particular setting where we're interacting with people around work and very pragmatic tools to move forward. Because I mean, I think it's a positive thing to have a growth mindset, right? That says that, you know, while I might have these skills, there is a ladder still to be
I think,
climbed.
yeah, that's another example of kind of what I got stuck on, because in I do some coaching, and a growth mindset is like a mental model that comes up a lot in coaching, and being able to help somebody notice when they're thinking about whatever their challenges are, in self-limiting ways compared to in ways that might create opportunities for them to change. I see that as transformative. It doesn't mean I need them to
Right.
transform, but I do think of, and again, maybe it's semantic because the way we're using the word transform has, I think, a couple of layers to it. So for example, when I talk about an organization changing, I think of its strategy changing, its behavior, its tactics, its what you see from the outside. But in order for a lot of organizational change to happen, transformation needs to happen, meaning that the way the people see themselves in relationship to the organization, and the way they see the potential and the potential mission or the potential purpose and the values of the organization, when that changes, I call that transformation. And when that happens, the strategy and the tactics and all of that, of course, changes, because the organization is inherently a different thing when the beliefs that underpin it have transformed. So maybe this is a word thing too. What do
Well,
you
and
think, Allison?
I think it's also when you're talking, I'm thinking of 4E cognition again. So we don't just think with our mind. So the idea of a mental model, I've been learning to let go of that a little bit as I'm getting more into the 4E cognition. So if we think with our environment, we think with others, I think part of it is changing the environment. So let's say, you care about recycling. What can happen on a local level that makes that happen? And I think people need to care about the issue before they can be told, here's the thing that you need to care about. And
Mhm.
that's where I'm talking about people working together. And, you know, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but I've had people very frustrated with me, my identity. I'm a white woman, and being approached that I need to own my privilege. I essentially have to transform myself so that I can see things differently in the environment. And I think in my mind, this question always comes in: why don't you just ask me for what you need? Like, why do I have to change? Can't we just talk about the needs and get to work together? And I think that's where people get stuck, is they are so concerned with I'm changing or fixing the other people, that they forget to ask what they need. Just ask for what you need. Let's just get to work, and we can create wonderful change, and we might just remain the same. So
Well, and I agree, Allison, with your insight that you can't move everything by exerting a positive force. What leapt to my mind was Werner Erhard used to have this idea. He called it a listening so powerful that it calls forth the speaking for which it is a listening. Which is like in Tai Chi Chuan, we don't just push out, we have this quasi mystical ability to pull actions towards us for our ability to work on them. And these are all the yin powers, right? The rollbacks and all the drawing in. And I mentioned in a story before where I had to lay hands on somebody who was getting violent, and then after I moved them out of the establishment, they went racing off. I immediately sent someone to apologize to them for me having had to lay hands on them.
mm,
Because there had been so much yang, there needed to be yin applied to that. And sometimes the behaviors that we wanna gently coerce people out of, they're very yang responses or actions, and so I think you're right that sometimes we can't meet it with a yang demand for transformation. We have to actually kinda draw out this other behavior in a more subtle, a yinner sort of a way. So this is kinda not as obvious. But so I think that you're right about that dynamic that you've identified there. Um,
and I also still agree with both of you, because I think personal development is one of my main focuses, but that's what I want, and that's what you both want, and we can't expect everyone to want that. I mean, there are people in my life that, oh, I wish over the years they would change, and it's just not going to happen. But what I can do is change the interactions I have with them so that it's more enjoyable and that we can actually get things done together.
Hmm.
right. Well, and then people are in different chapters, and there are different stages in a progressive curriculum in their hermeneutical process, which I think of just as, "How do I not misunderstand?
Yeah.
How do I not misunderstand?" And a lot of times I think, we talk about we will refer to the coastline of Norway as an external object that maybe we make a measurement of and we say, okay, it's 800 miles long, but really that's just because we've picked the smallest segments. And if we were to pick smaller segments and map more niches and peninsulas, we would get a longer length. And if we were even more resolved, we get an even longer length. So that in fact, the coastline of Norway is really infinite.
Mm,
And what we're really measuring is our resolution in our measuring of it. And so when we apply that to another person, we never really get the person. We never really get the actual coast of Norway. We just get our mapping of it to whatever resolution we have chosen to dial in. And a lot of problems I think are solved, and you're pointing to that a lot of these things can be resolved just by dialing in and getting a better picture of that part of the coast. And then you'll see those little inlets that you missed before.
right. Yeah. Yeah. Because the map's not the territory, is the saying, right? You got to zoom into the
Exactly.
territory to understand. And what is the territory of any one of us? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, at least for the left brain, the map is not the territory. I'm holding out very high hopes for the right brain. I've been listening to Ian
Yeah.
McGilchrist, and I do think that it's stupid for us not to try to understand our consciousness from the outside and from the scientific ways as well as from the inside. I'm one that I always want to say one of the things about hermeneutics is that the more subjective experience I have, the more meaning I can pull out of an event or a situation. In objective science, my subjective capacity is a contaminant. Um, but so this idea, this is where mentors come in. They've absorbed more. They have a bigger model, so we can actually borrow that a little bit.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to the mentor idea. Thanks for bringing that back up. Allison, are you okay to change gears to
Yep.
that?
Yeah, sure. Let's
Okay.
do it.
So you said that part of what moral courage does is, I believe, train mentors that stay on in an organization after moral courage has done whatever its intervention is to kind of continue the work in the organization, and I can absolutely see that idea sustaining. I'm wondering if what your vision is for how that scales and what kind of impact that might have long term. Where do you imagine mentors are going to sit? Are there sectors of our civilization where you especially want to see that kind of mentorship take hold? Yeah, just curious how you think about it.
Yeah, I would say universities definitely, and K through 12 schools. So right now we have in both areas educators, faculty, and universities. We have staff members. We even have had students come through. I have mentors from nonprofits as well, and organizations we do some work with still, but the bulk is from the universities. And what we are I'll tell you about the program I'm about to launch in July. So there's a new cohort enrolling. And in the past, it's been about 4 months long, and we've pared it back to 2 months just because people are so, pressed for time. And they come through 4 weeks where they're learning about basically complexity science and relational leadership and the skills of moral courage. They can choose two different capstone projects for the remaining 4 weeks of the 8-week program. One of them is to teach we have a new documentary that's been released. It's called Mississippi Turning. And actually, you'll publish this. You know about it from the newsletter. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, you should talk about the
Okay.
documentary for sure.
So I think, next, this is going to be released a little bit after our next live stream. So I'll tell folks you can find the documentary on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, the Moral Courage YouTube channel. You can stream it for free. And we're going to release free educator material. So anybody who wants to bring this documentary to the university or their school will be able to do it. But back to the mentor.
We'll make sure that's in the show notes
Okay.
too, so that people can always go and grab that information where we'll have it accessible for them.
That's awesome. Thank you. And then back to the mentor program. So the first capstone project is teaching moral courage through that case study, the skills of moral courage. But folks can also choose another option, which is how to solve a real world problem. I can't even speak. Real world problem, either in their family or, their workplace, using the prompt, what's keeping you up at night? Identify a problem, and then we look. How would you describe it from being on the inside? Now describe it as if you're a third person looking in. What do you see? What do you see you're doing? What are the roles you're playing? They work with a partners throughout this process. So there's a partner in the organization that they can kind of have these conversations with. They need to come up with a hypothesis. They need to gather information from other coworkers. Do you see the problem the same way I do? Okay, do you see it differently? So you're getting at that viewpoint diversity, and then they come up with a plan for change. And there is, someone within that organization that they'll be able to talk to about this change. So we want people, this is helping people discover where they can actually identify a problem. They have agency, they have power to do that. They can start having the necessary conversations so that they can bring a coherent message to people that might be able to help them make this happen. So less talk, more action.
Got it. That makes me curious if you want to say something about who should get involved with moral courage and how might they do that.
Well, I would say visit our website. If you would like to talk to me or Irshad, you can submit a request right through our website, and we can tell you more. We'll have that one-on-one conversation. And I would say there are particular universities that we're working with that already have mentors in house. I could probably give you a list to put in the show notes there if you'd like. If anybody within those universities might like to contact some of the mentors that are there, they could do that. But I would also say follow Moral Courage on LinkedIn and Instagram, because we'll announce more there. I'll end with this. The overall plan, because Moral Courage is a journey, is we usually, Irshad and I start with one or two workshops to launch the program. And then we take applicants who want to continue into the mentor certification program. So we start big and then we funnel it down to a select few that make it into the program. And once they graduate, they go back into that organization. So, yeah.
Am I correct that I would reach out to you if I'm noticing in my organization kind of intractable problems
Yep.
that we can't talk about effectively? Is that
Yep. Please, individuals, please reach out. Leaders can reach out for sure. And we'll have those conversations with you.
awesome? Um, is there, Brian or Allison, is there anything else that you want to raise?
I think this was a good conversation. I'm good. It was fun.
Good.
I think I would just want to say that my one string banjo thing is about virtue, and moral courage is a foundational virtue for all the other virtues. I think Maya Angelou even said that you really can't practice the other virtues unless you have a certain amount of moral courage. And I maybe I sound overly Aristotelian, but I believe him when he says that when we operate out of the highest aspects of our humanity, we bring ourselves closer to what he called eudaimonia, which gets translated as the good life or the fulfillment of what it is to be human. And so I just can't stress enough, whether it's within an organizational setting or just within your own life, to understand the role that moral courage plays. And that I like to hold up my little skull, memento mori. Make your decisions based on your understanding of your life as a whole, not in the short term momentary things. Like, think of who you are as a legacy, and that's where moral courage really shines. When there are people in history that we remember purely for their moral courage, and they become like a guide light for humanity in the future. And I think that another theme that I like to visit a lot is James Joyce, and this idea that the heroic shows up in the commonplace, in every man. It's Ulysses, but it's really just this guy walking around Dublin. But the heroic actually manifests not always in big performative actions, but in just manifesting what we know in our hearts to be the right thing. And so that's, I guess, my parting shot is be all you can be.
You can be. And I love what you said, Brian. My heroes are not well-known names, but they're people that are deeply important to me. So I'm happy you ended on that.
Well, I can speak firsthand, having worked with Moral Courage in a professional context, that it's a unique organization and a transformative one. And I'm so happy that you're out there doing the work that you're doing, Allison, and think the world of you and Irshad. And I'm really grateful that you spent some time with us today, and would love to have you back sometime and hear more about how the programs are developing and the work that you're doing out in the world.
I would love to. And thank you, Boaz, for being a champion for moral courage over the last, I don't know, I've known you for three and a half years.
At
Maybe that's
least,
when we first
yeah,
met. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So thank you.
yeah. Good.